Empire, a brutal totalitarian government run by the monarchical House of Romanov, which ruled Russia under various governments in 1613 and the Russian Empire from 1721 to 1917. Its leader, Tsar Nicholas II, carried the name Bloody Nicholas for his anti-Semitic policy and brutal suppression of protesters. Events like Bloody Sunday of 1905, the complete slaughter of anti-Nicholas protesters, had demolished his support and fueled intense rage within the citizens. Tsar Nicholas II was also a very indecisive leader and had poor grasp on many aspects of his policy. The result was a displeased and alienated working class and a massive starvation problem. Eventually they reached their limit and the February Revolution began. Under extreme pressure brought on by the revolution, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne and abolish the government on March 15, 1917. This marked the fall of the imperial government. Almost immediately after the fall of imperialism, the Russian Provisional Government was formed. The government had tried very hard to eliminate the problems seen in the Russian Empire. They promised numerous freedoms, like freedom of speech and press, in response to the cruel suppression of the czars. They also based their allocation of power on election, which responded to the issue of monarchy, which was viewed as outdated and unfair. While it seemed like a promising government, and while many would argue that it was a major improvement on the empire, it would eventually face many problems. While the Bolshevik Revolution itself was the key point that changed Russia's government to communism, the events leading up to the revolution are far more interesting and relevant. As mentioned before, there are not many core problems with the concept of the provisional government in its basic sense, but the numerous points of instability were. The first and largest factor contributing to the failure of the provisional government was its decision to stay in World War I. After the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the formation of the provisional government, Russia was wrought with instability. The people had many questions and concerns about the new system of power they had been put under. The working class wanted to know how the provisional government would treat them fairly, and the poor wanted to know about possible government welfare programs. However, finding World War I a priority, General Alexei Brusilov ignored the entropy of the populace and obtained the majority of government funds for war efforts. As a result of the disorder of the country, not only did the power of the army suffer, but the people did too. The jobs created by the war were hazardous and low-paying, although they were taken by the low working class who had no choice but to accept them. The government had also spent little attention on domestic issues since they had made the war their primary focus. The result was another angered community. These were problems not only because of their obvious detrimental effects, but because they were extremely similar to the controversies of the empire. The people felt betrayed and angry. The civilians also saw no point in their work since the military endeavors were all atrocious failures. The irritation towards the government resulted in the formation and empowerment of the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks were an outspoken and militant opponent of the provisional government. They were led by the politician and communist philosopher Vladimir Lenin. In the wake of all this distress and agony of pointless violence, the hand of Vladimir Lenin descended down, offering in his palm the glorious light of communism, which would save them from the fascist bourgeoisie controlling Russia. These kinds of promises made by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who operated on the platform which spent most of its time listing the problems of the provisional government as an uncaring bureaucracy run by the spoiled middle to upper class, and spent noticeably less time on the strength of communism. However, this methodology and charisma won him the support of Russia's lower class. The main reason the message of communism stuck so firmly with the lower class was because it was easy to understand, and beyond that, it just felt good. The positive attitude towards the Bolsheviks stemmed from the sense of strength and community they gave to a divided and weak people. The pride it put on people made them extremely willing to participate in the cause. The pride would often be generated and maintained with well-designed propaganda posters. These propaganda posters were often depictions of soldiers, symbols of strength, paired with working class people in order to support that idea of unity and strength. Posters like the ones being displayed right now. These were so successful in rallying support because the message was easy to understand. They didn't have to understand politics of either government to understand that they were part of something big, something that would pave the road for a better tomorrow. Lenin was also very good at being accessible in his writing. He was short and concise. Lenin's April Thieves was an article written by Vladimir Lenin, published April 7, 1917 in Pravda, the most read Bolshevik newspaper. In this article, Lenin numerically listed what the goals of the Bolsheviks were. The promises made were very hopeful in the eyes of the lower class. For example, the fifth point promised that the country would be run by a republic of Soviet agricultural laborers and peasant deputies throughout the country from top to bottom. To this sounded like they would be directly in charge of the country, At this point, Lenin became the puppet master of thousands of passionate soldiers, ready to take up arms. With the Bolshevik Party reaching the point of an inspiring mass of obedient followers, Lenin started to militarize the Bolsheviks, urging the party members to arm themselves for the coming revolution. While this was heavily expected from everyone involved, it was made into an official instruction with a speech given by Lenin on June 17, 1917. In the speech, Lenin tells all of his followers to gather arms that they may use to fight in the revolution. Also, to ensure their participation, he emphasizes that while it is not favorable, it is necessary. With this, the working class began to arm themselves with whatever they could, and so the clock counting down to the revolution began. After the speech, the Bolsheviks continued creating support for communism while simultaneously lowering it for the provisional government. As mentioned before, the military of the provisional government was an absolute disaster. They failed time and time again. After the complete failure of the July offensive, Prime Minister Kerensky replaced General Brusilov with General Kornilov. With further turmoil, the Prime Minister made a drastic totalitarian decision which appointed Kornilov supreme commander of the military. Kornilov then made radical demands such as the reenactment of the death penalty and to remilitarize factories. This was the final straw for the Bolsheviks. They started making plans to usurp power until a golden opportunity was presented to them. Kornilov had begun to make an attempt to violently force the resignation of the leaders of Russia so that he could take total control. Kornilov ordered an invasion of Petrograd, where Prime Minister Kerensky was located. In a desperate plea, Kerensky requested the aid of the Soviets. They agreed and mobilized 25,000 troops to take control of the area. However, even though this was done at the request of Kerensky, Lenin made it completely clear that they were only fighting against Kornilov and not for Kerensky. After Petrograd, the Bolsheviks took Moscow in a series of battles, and in a letter from Lenin to the Central Committee and the Moscow and Petrograd committees, he wrote, "The Bolsheviks, having obtained a majority of the Soviets' workers and the soldiers' deputies of both capitals, can and must take state power into their own hands." He also added that if they did not do it, someone else would take advantage of the situation and take control themselves. The reform of this was the creation of Communist Russia, which would later be established as the USSR. While this reform did stabilize Russia for a brief period, and some would argue that its original platform may have been an improvement on the provisional government, it was destined to fail. After Lenin died in 1924 and Stalin came into power, he over-militarized the nation, which would soon relapse into the poverty and starvation of the previous governments. However, unlike its predecessor, this government would not be so generous with its freedoms. Unlike the provisional government, the USSR was very intolerant of criticism and would squash any signs of protest. This made the government extremely effective at repressing rebellion. The Russian people would suffer under the USSR until 1991, where the government was dissolved.